I am Jay Barth. I'm the director of the Clinton Presidential Library, and on behalf of everybody here at the Clinton Presidential Center, at the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton School of Public Service, and the Clinton Library, welcome to another event in our Clinton Presidential Center Presents series. And again, I want to make a special shout out to our online guests this evening. Tonight's event is going to be a bit different than most of our events in that you, the audience, both here in the Great Hall and online, will be active participants in the second half of our session this evening. In the next hour and a half, three things are going to happen. First off, Jean Becker, former Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush and a veteran of the White House during the Bush years, working in the office of First Lady Barbara Bush, will provide a brief overview of her new book about President Bush just days before the centennial of his birth on June 12th. In Character Matters and Other Life Lessons from George H.W. Bush, Jean recounts touching and important life lessons from a leader with whom she worked so closely over so many years. Character Matters will be for sale after tonight's event just outside the Great Hall, and Jean will be available for signing. Then Jean will be joined on stage by two other individuals for a conversation about a distinctive partnership, that grew between President Bush and President Bill Clinton following their hard-fought 1992 campaign. Joining Jean will be Linda Lorelle, an Emmy Award-winning journalist and winner of the Gracie Award given by the American Women in Radio and Television. Linda is host and producer of an award-winning podcast, Our Voices Matter, dedicated to reminding us of our common humanity. And Linda's work centers on bridging our divides, including that as co-founder of Civil Dialogues, a democracy initiative launched earlier this year. The final participant in the conversation will be Stephanie Streett, my colleague and executive director of the Clinton Foundation. Stephanie, Linda, and Jean will engage in a conversation about the partnership between Presidents Clinton and Bush, but also about the importance of such trusting relationships in bridging differences in politics more generally. And finally, led by Linda, those who are part of this event as an audience will participate in a brief discourse about trust, the role of trust in our own lives and in the life of our community. Those of you who are online will enter breakout groups to allow you to fully participate in this conversation. Tonight's program is part of Civil Dialogues, a joint initiative among the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, the Clinton Presidential Center, and the LBJ Foundation that aims to facilitate dialogue on important issues facing our country today. This Civil Dialogues program is hosted in partnership with Living Room Conversations and All Sides. One of the goals that President Clinton saw for his presidential center was bringing people together for conversations about our toughest issues in a civil manner. And we see tonight's initiative as a continuation of that work. Moreover, because of the challenges facing civic health in Arkansas brought to light by the recently released Arkansas Civic Health Index report, we here at the Clinton Center are doubling down on the role we can play in improving civic health, from our work on basic civic education to our work in promoting healthy dialogues crucial to a healthy civil space. Let's begin tonight's program by turning it over to Jean Becker. Thank y'all.
Okay, I want to thank all of you hearty souls for coming out tonight. For those of you watching online, it is really stormy out here, so thank you for those of you who came in person. Thank you, Dr. Barth. Thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me tonight. It is such an honor to be here. President Bush would be so happy that I was here. As you can tell from Jay's opening remarks, we have a lot to talk about, so I'm gonna jump right in. And believe it or not, I'm gonna start by telling you a story about one of the biggest disagreements I ever had with George Herbert Walker Bush. All of you remember Hurricane Katrina. The whole country remembers Hurricane Katrina. What a lot of people don't know is a week after Katrina, another hurricane called Hurricane Rita came ashore in Louisiana and pretty well destroyed the rest of the Louisiana shore west of New Orleans and part of Texas. And nobody was paying attention to anything, to anybody. with Hurricane Rita, because everybody was in New Orleans. And so a man called our office, called President Bush's office, and wanted to know, said that his hometown of Cameron, Louisiana, had literally been flattened by Rita. And would President Bush help raise money so they could at least build an emergency room? The hospital was flattened, and this man, Richard Sluislock, said, if people just had access to health care, we can start rebuilding our town. And President Bush said, of course. And so we raised $1 million, and the week before Christmas, we were going to Cameron with $1 million to break ground for the new emergency room. And about a week before the event, I was walking President Bush through the schedule. The governor was coming in the marching band, the high school marching band, and he looked at me and he said, Jean, it's a really boring schedule. This is boring. I wouldn't come to this. He says, we need to do something more exciting for these people. It's perhaps with a little bit of attitude, I said, I think a former president coming to town with $1 million the week before Christmas is pretty exciting. And he said, no, I have an idea, which were the scariest words the man ever said to me. He said, Barr and I have been watching this TV show. We watch it every night. We just love it. The name of the show is ER. And he said, there's this young star, this young man who I think is the star. His name is George Clooney. And I'm thinking, why don't we invite George Clooney to come to Cameron, Louisiana with us? He said, Jean, ER? Do you get it? Well, here's what he didn't get. They're watching reruns on TBS. ER is no longer on television. George Clooney's making all those ocean movies. He's People Magazine's Sexiest Man of the Year. They're running about 10 years behind the rest of the country. And I said, sir, with all due respect, George Clooney is not coming to Cameron, Louisiana. I told him ER was no longer on TV, and he said, every night, Jean. I'm like, oh boy. And I said, okay, we don't know George Clooney. He's not in my Rolodex. We don't know anyone who knows George Clooney. I think his politics are a little bit to the left of yours. George Clooney's not coming to Cameron, Louisiana. Jake, it's time. That would be George Clooney and George Bush in Cameron, Louisiana. He came. It's a long story why he came. But I love telling this story because, as usual, the things that President Bush did and the way his mind works, I learned so much from him. I like telling the story because, let's face it, the picture is just so darn cute. But just like everything that President Bush did, there was a lesson to be learned. And in this case, it was, don't be afraid to think big. I was thinking high school marching band. He thought George Clooney. He loved to quote hockey great Wayne Gretzky, who once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Take your shot. I actually put this story is not in this book that we're going to talk about tonight. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the 25 years I was President Bush's chief of staff. And after he died, I wasn't sure I should write a book. And then I decided it'd be criminal not to because I had so many great stories to tell. Let's just say my life was never boring. Mikhail Gorbachev once told me to shut up. I'm oddly very proud of that. And I was once kissed by Tom Selleck. Okay, the young people are like, who cares? But I can tell the older women are like, oh yeah, you get it, yeah. You definitely get it. As I wrote The Man I Knew, I realized there was a lot more coming out of me about George Bush than funny stories. I realized that he really did leave us a blueprint on how to live a life well lived. And perhaps there is no better example. One of his mottos in life was that any definition of a successful life must include service to others. And perhaps there's no better example of a servant's heart than his extraordinary friendship and partnership with William Jefferson Clinton. Jake, could you show the next photo? They actually got together to help raise money for a tsunami, which is another big, long story. The President of the United States, who happened to be George W. Bush, asked the two of them to partner to raise money for this huge tsunami in South Asia. So they did the Bush-Clinton Tsunami Fund, then there was a Bush-Clinton Katrina Fund. Here, they're actually on the beach in Galveston, Texas. This is after Hurricane Ike. And I remember when Hurricane Ike came ashore in Galveston, President Bush, 41 as we called him, he called President Clinton and said, "Bill, Hurricane Ike, are you in?" And he says, "Of course, George, I'm in, let's go." And President Bush called the President of the United States, and I could hear the President, he says, "George, go out and announce the Bush-Clinton Ike Fund." I called Bill, he's all in, we're going to work, so announces. I could hear the President say, "Okay, Dad." But the two of them, their partnership literally raised hundreds of millions of dollars for disaster relief. They found their niche, and they love being able to help raise money. If you could show the next story, Jake, the next photo. Please ignore the woman in the back. She looks like me, but I would never photobomb a picture of presidents. Ignore that woman back there. This picture is actually taken at Texas A&M University. Hurricane Harvey dumped 50 inches of rain on Houston, Texas in 48 hours, one of the largest natural disasters in the history of the country. And all the former presidents wanted to help. They all wanted to come together. This is backstage before a big concert. I will tell you a funny story about President Clinton. I let my fellow chief of staffs know that the two George Bushes were going to host a fundraiser at President Bush's library at Texas A&M. I said, just FYI, a Saturday night in October, we do not expect your president to come. And President Obama's chief of staff called and said he actually would like to come. He's in, he's free that night, and he can bring with him Lady Gaga. And I'm like, hell yes, tell him to come and bring. So then President Clinton's chief of staff called and said, he's supposed to be in Europe, but if you think he's going to let Barack Obama come to Texas and hang out with the Bush boys without him, think again. And then I called President Carter's chief of staff and I said, they're all coming. And she said, oh, he'll come too. So, you know what I love about this photo? This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way it used to be. This is the way it was supposed to be. This is the way it can be again. One more funny story about President Clinton. When they became great friends, sometimes people who didn't understand the friendship would ask President Bush, why are you friends with Bill Clinton? And he would always say, I'm old. I've run out of things to talk about. And when I'm with Bill, I don't have to worry about it because he does all the talking. I want you to look at this photo. Who's talking? I do, yes, Stephanie, it would be your boss. Anyway, my editor felt so strongly about what we could learn from all of this that he encouraged me to write a second book, Character Matters and Other Life Lessons from George Herbert Walker Bush. If you could show the cover of that book, Jake. Before we start our panel discussion, I would love just to read a few excerpts from the book. I think I'm going to cut the first one out. If we get bored later, I'll go back to it. This first excerpt, what I did with Character Matters, by the way, I emailed all of President Bush's friends and former staff and family and said, do you have a story you can tell that would help illustrate his character or something that you learned from him? There's 156 different essays in this book. And it's everybody from former Prime Minister John Major of Great Britain, former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, to President Clinton and Nancy Pelosi, to Bob Gates, and Dan Quayle wrote the epilogue. It's a very bipartisan book and includes a young man who used to mow the yard at Walker's Point. It covers the whole spectrum of life. This essay is from Joe Strauss, who's former Speaker of the House in Texas. Standing on what he called the front porch of democracy to give his inaugural address on January 20th in 1989, President Bush said, I take as my guide the hope of a saint. In crucial things, unity. in important things diversity, in all things generosity. In a present era when partisanship has risen and tribalism has spread, there is great impact in those three basic ideas: unity, diversity, and generosity. Too often, the way to get ahead in politics is by appealing to someone's worst instincts rather than their better angels. We have been conditioned to think that the path to power is through dividing and conquering. In contrast, President Bush built bipartisan coalitions around lasting achievements, from the passage of Americans with Disabilities Act to Operation Desert Storm. I can think of no better remedy to the tribalism in our politics today than the words President Bush spoke and the approach he embodied. He knew how to tap into our common goodness rather than trying to exploit our differences. Every day, people go to extraordinary lengths to extend a hand of help or compassion, whether in their vocation or their spare time. Why should our politics be so different? We can be competitive without being caustic. The principles that President Bush promoted in his inaugural address and in so much of his life, in and out of office, are bigger than any one political party or ideology. Decency and goodness transcend any construct of conservative versus liberal or red versus blue. The last thing I'm going to read is President Bush's radio address to the nation a couple days after he lost to President Clinton. This is November 7th, 1992. Here we go. Way back in 1945, Winston Churchill was defeated at the polls. He said, "I have been given the Order of the Boot. That is the exact same position in which I find myself today. I admit this is not the position I would have preferred, but it is a judgment I honor. Having known the sweet taste of popular favor, I can more readily accept the sour taste of defeat because it is seasoned for me by my deep devotion to the political system under which this nation has thrived for 2 centuries. Ours is a nation that has shed the blood of war and cried the tears of depression. We have stretched the limits of human imagination and seen the technologically miraculous become almost mundane. Always, always, our advantage has been our spirit, a constant confidence, a sense that in America, the only things not yet accomplished are the things that have not yet been tried. President-elect Clinton needs all Americans to unite behind him so he can move our nation forward. But more than that, he will need to draw upon this unique American spirit. There are no magic outside solutions to our problems. The real answers lie within us. We need more than a philosophy of entitlement. We need to all pitch in, lend a hand, and do our part to help forge a brighter future for this country. With this spirit, we can realize the golden opportunities before us and make sure that our new day, like every American day, is filled with hope and promise. That was his reaction to losing the election. And it's part of why we're here tonight, to talk about how we can get back to that place in our country where we don't yell and shout at each other, but we may actually talk about things. More than a year ago, my friend Linda Lorelle and I were sitting in a bar. Okay, I know that's not true. She knows how I feel. We were in a restaurant having lunch, but that's so boring. So picture us in a bar, drinking. Our lunch conversation was dominated by concern for our democracy, and we decided it was time to stop yelling at our TV and do something, do anything. We began a conversation with the heads of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, the LBJ Library Foundation, and Stephanie here at the Clinton Library Foundation, and a few other groups along the way. We finally kicked off our civil dialogue series at the Baker Institute at Rice University in February. We were at the LBJ Library in March, and here we are today. And we have a number of other events coming up. During the next year, we will have a series of dialogues at other presidential library centers. Will be at President Bush's library in October, policy institutes and other forums to discuss some of the important topics of the day. The idea is to give you a chance to listen to experts who can talk about various sides of all the issues, and then give you a chance to ask your questions, voice your concerns, and make your opinion known. No shouting, no name calling, no vitriol, just dialogue. And on that note, I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Linda.
Thank you so much, Jean. You're amazing. I love being your partner. And as you indicated, this is our third Civil Dialogues Town Hall, and just as I did in Houston and in Austin, tonight here in Little Rock, I feel the presence of President George H.W. Bush. That day in the restaurant, not the bar, in the restaurant, when we hatched this crazy idea called Civil Dialogues, I think we were channeling what 41 would do if he were still with us. He would be using his voice to help elevate the voices of the vast majority of Americans who want to lead with love rather than hate, who want to create a climate of understanding and tolerance, who want to get back to our elected leaders working together to solve the nation's problems, who want to be able to disagree without demonizing. It is heartening to see all of you here tonight, especially given the weather that you had to brave to be in this room. And also, we've got more than 100 people joining us online. Thank you for doing that. We all chose to be here tonight because we are tired of the division in our country, and we recognize the existential threat it poses to our democracy. We want to find our way out of it and preserve the way of life that has been the envy of the world since our birth almost 250 years ago. This isn't the first time the American experiment has been tested, nor will it be the last. But this is our time. And the question is, how will we respond in this moment? It helps to have historical perspective, and that's where we begin at each of our town halls, as we just did with Jean. She started us off with powerful reflections from our 41st president, reminding us of the relevance of his words and his life. And of course, tonight, we are gathered in the Presidential Library Center dedicated to our 42nd president. As different as these men were, they were so much alike when it came to their profound understanding that the strength of our democracy lies in our shared humanity. Here now is a brief video clip from America's Millennium Memorial Gala at the Lincoln Monument. The speech was delivered by President William Jefferson Clinton on December 31st, 1999. Let's watch.
The great story of the 20th century is the triumph of freedom and free people. A story told in the drama of new immigrants, the struggles for equal rights, the victories over totalitarianism, the stunning advances in economic well-being, in culture, in health, in space, in telecommunications, and in building a world in which more than half the people live under governments of their own choosing for the first time in all history. We must never forget the meaning of the 20th century, or the gifts of those who worked and marched, who fought and died for the triumph of freedom. If the story of the 20th century is the triumph of freedom. What will the story of the 21st century be? Let it be the triumph of freedom wisely used, to bring peace to a world in which we honor our differences and, even more, our common humanity. Such a triumph will require great efforts from us all. It will require us to stand against the forces of hatred and bigotry, terror and destruction. It will require us to continue to prosper, to alleviate poverty, to better balance the demands of work and family, and to serve each of us in our communities. Now, we may not be able to eliminate all hateful intolerance, but we can develop a healthy intolerance of bigotry, oppression, and abject poverty. We may not be able to eliminate all the harsh consequences of globalization, but we can communicate more and travel more and trade more in a way that lifts the lives of ordinary working families everywhere and the quality of our global environment. We may not be able to eliminate all the failures of government and international institutions, but we can certainly strengthen democracy so all children are prepared for the 21st century world and protected from its harshest side effects. And we can do so much more to work together, to cooperate among ourselves, to seize the problems and the opportunities of this ever-small planet we all call home. In short, if we want the story of the 21st century to be the triumph of peace and harmony, we must embrace our common humanity and our shared destiny.
So the question is, what will be the story of the next 6 months and beyond? Will we give in to the forces of division, hatred, and chaos, or will we heed the call of our 41st and 42nd presidents to allow our diversity to bring us together, not drive us apart? To let the triumph of freedom, wisely used, bring peace to a world in which we honor our differences and, even more, our common humanity. Your presence here tonight indicates that you are not ready to give in. So let's get to work. Coming up in just a bit, you will have an opportunity to roll up your sleeves and practice skills like listening, empathy, and curiosity to help tap into our shared humanity. But first, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. There is no one better to give us a glimpse into the friendship and partnership of two American presidents who went from bitter enemies to best friends, and what we can all learn from their example. Please welcome the Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation, Stephanie Streett, and author and former Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush, Jean Becker. Come on up, ladies. Okay, here we go. All right, so we all know that they became friends. We know the story. Jean's already shared a little bit of it with us, but let's go deeper, because this relationship between these two men goes back farther than most people know. So Stephanie, tell us about that.
You're right. I think a lot of people don't realize that President Bush, 41, and President Clinton actually met many years before the election of 1991 and 92. They actually first had an opportunity to meet in 1983 when Vice President Bush called all the nation's governors together for a meeting in Walker's Point in Kennebunkport, where they have their family residence. And President Clinton came, and Hillary Rodham Clinton came at that point as well, and they brought Chelsea because they invited Vice President Bush invited the governors and their spouses and their families to come, which again, I think speaks to President Bush that he would include their families. Mm-hmm. So Chelsea came, and this is a story I think probably some of you have heard before, but President Clinton was so enamored with Vice President Bush's compassion. Chelsea they were at a picnic, and Chelsea turned to her dad and mom and said, "I have to go to the bathroom." And they did not know, obviously, where that was. And so President Bush came over, and he said, "Here, Chelsea, come with me." He took her by the hand, and he's like, "I've got it, I've got it." And he took her inside, took her to the restroom, visited with her for a while, obviously brought her back into the party. But that meant so much to President Clinton, that he was so kind and so compassionate, then came and instead of having an aide who could have easily called an aide over to help, he personally forged that bond with Chelsea, and she's never forgotten it either and has talks about it too. That was really the first time that they engaged and met.
So the relationship obviously goes back that far. So there was a foundation. There was a foundation there, which I think was probably really important. But of course, they had a very, very bitter campaign, 1991, 1992. What do you remember from that in terms of their relationship and what that was like for your president?
Let me also mention another time that they came together when President Bush was president. Again, he called all the nation's governors together to focus on education and held a big education summit and invited, obviously, President Clinton, who was the governor of Arkansas, and he was very familiar with the really groundbreaking work that Governor Clinton and First Lady of Arkansas at that time, Hillary Rodham Clinton, had done to reform our education system here. So on that basis, he asked President Clinton to be a speaker and participate in this conference. And that also meant a lot to President Clinton. Again, on the other side of the aisle, President Bush, as president, reached out and asked him. They had conversations. They worked together to plan the agenda for the summit. And so, like as you mentioned, that was sort of a foundation for their relationship. So going into the campaign, there was a level of mutual respect, I think, between both of them. We all know that campaigns can be can get kind of tough and ugly. There were a lot of moments in the 92 campaign. I remember I was a teenager working on that campaign. But anyway, it was really rough. There was a lot of things said on both sides that were painful, a lot of things said by staff people, but that's not unusual. We all know how that is. Campaigns happen. And then, because of our country and our strong foundation, our democracy, what happens at the end of a campaign is that the winner and the loser, they come together, they meet at Blair House. President and Mrs. Bush hosted then Governor and First Lady of Arkansas, Hillary Clinton, and had a wonderful visit. They were so gracious to the Clintons. Mrs. Bush spent a lot of time with the First Lady of Arkansas on that trip, helping her understand the White House. She knew that their concern was going to be for their 12-year-old daughter, Chelsea. And I've heard Secretary Clinton at times remark again how gracious and lovely Barbara Bush was, and had taken and had Jenna and had her granddaughters, had other people there too to talk to her so that she could feel her way around. Anyway, again, that's the way our nation is supposed to work. And then after that, you heard the beautiful letter, you heard the beautiful speech President Bush made in his concession. And that's the way it's supposed to happen. I mean, it was a tough campaign. I remember thinking as a campaign staffer, wow, this is so ugly. How could it be any worse than this? And so,
I was just going to say, and as painful as it was for President Bush, I mean, he still found a way.
He found a beautiful way. And he wrote the most beautiful, and maybe you'll speak to it later, note that he left in the Resolute desk for George Bush. And again, President Clinton, that meant so much to him. In his letter, he only made one request to President Clinton, which was to make sure that his points of light, which was his foundation, that he spent so much time and continues to spend so much time with, that he preserved that. And President Clinton honored that request and, in fact, continues to play a role in Points of Light and usually comes to the galas and has always been very supportive. So, again, it was tough. It was ugly. But the example that those two set and continued to set
but
was
as tough and
really
as ugly as it was, the humanity.
the humanity.
Humanity
Both
remained.
of them
Yeah.
showed their humanity.
Jean,
So-
Talk a little bit about either the resolute desk note or the letter, the diary entry that President Bush made to himself, how he should respond to the election. What do you want to share about this time?
The letter that he left in the Oval Office for President Clinton is in The Man I Knew. I don't have it with me. I'm not going to try to, it's a beautiful letter, and I will not do it justice. But the main thing he said to President Clinton is, "You are now my president. You are now my president, and I'm here to support you." And that started a tradition of, I know that President Clinton left a letter for George W. George W. left a letter for Barack Obama. It started a tradition. So the night, what you're referring to in Character Matters is the night President Bush lost the election. What I read you was his radio address to the nation the Saturday after the election on Tuesday. The night he lost the election, he wrote in his diary, it's 12:15 in the morning, and he talks about how much it hurts. He talks about it's not the outcome he wanted, but he sort of gave himself advice. He said, finish strong, be a good sport, do what's right for the country, and help the incoming president. He basically was giving himself a pep talk on what he needed to do, which is exactly what he did do. And then he went back to so I will represent the losing side of the 1992 election. It hurt. I mean, President Bush used to tell people, there was a man who came, well, actually, it was the coach of Texas A&M, R.C. Slocum, football coach, got fired. He's still the most winningest coach in A&M history, but then president of Texas A&M, Bob Gates, fired him. And President Bush invited R.C. Slocum to come have lunch with him the next day in Houston. And he said to R.C., I know you're hurt, but he said, just keep in mind, I was fired by the American people. I heard him use that term a couple of times, but he used to say it just to let people know, I know how you feel. I've been where you got fired by Bob Gates. I got fired by the American people. And RC has an essay in the book, and he just did a book event with me. And he said, you know, Jean, it did make me feel better when he told me that. But what President Bush did for the first year in Houston, 1993, he licked his wounds. He sort of figured out what he wanted the rest of his life to look like. And he decided he wanted to get back in the game and to be a point of light and to make a difference. And that his mission in life wasn't done yet. And really, so he got to work and did a lot of philanthropic work, but the highlight was really when the 43rd President of the United States asked President Bush and President Clinton to partner on the tsunami. Mrs. Bush used to call them the odd couple. And they became such good friends that the 4 Bush sons used to call President Clinton their brother by another mother.
So Jean, take us back to the beginning of that, because they were not, they were not close at that point. They were not close.
They were not close.
So you were there. You watched this friendship sort of blossom. What did you witness? Take us into the room.
They had a very cordial relationship. President Clinton came to the opening of President Bush's library, which was 1997. President Bush, of course, came to the opening of this library.
Kind of like today.
It was exactly a day like today. I remember the Bushes came home and had a lot of stories about the weather. So they were cordial, but they were not close. So what happened is they got together to raise money. This horrific tsunami had come ashore in South Asia on Christmas Day, 2004. And the U.S. government was sending troops and an aircraft carrier. It was a horrific, just tens of thousands of people died. Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. Who really needed help were our big nonprofit agencies, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, AmeriCares. I know I'm leaving some out. They were all racing to the region, but they needed a huge infusion of cash. to tackle this issue. So that is what President Bush 43 asked the two of them to do, was to raise money for the nonprofit sector. Then he asked them to go to the region on his behalf. He asked the two presidents if they would go and visit the countries, meet with the heads of state, bring him a first-hand report of how recovery was going and what needed to be done. So I went with them, and the first thing that happened, there's only one bed on board the Air Force plane they gave us, and President Clinton gave it to President Bush. That was big. That was really big. Now, I did my part. I stayed up all night playing Oh Hell with him, his favorite card game. But anyway, I had never met him, and I introduced myself. President Bush had not been diagnosed with Parkinson's yet, but we all knew that something was going on with him. He was very unsteady on his feet. He sometimes had a hard time getting up from a chair. We were worried about him, and he wasn't in the mood to think about it or worry about it. He just thought it was old age. I was really worried about this trip. It was a tough schedule, a lot of media, very high profile. So I told President Clinton, I said, he would kill me for telling you this, but we think there's something going on with him. Would you look out for him? Because, in a big high-profile trip, you don't want any staff in the photo. You don't want me up on stage helping him up. I said, would you look out for him? He can be unsteady on his feet. He can have a hard time going up and down stairs. Well, President Clinton just took it to heart. He was so protective of him and never left him behind. And very discreetly, he just took him under his wing. I don't think anyone, the press or anyone watching, would ever guess what was going on. President Clinton was so good at it. So the flip side of this is President Bush has never been late in his life, and President Clinton's never been on time in his life.
That's an exaggeration, as his former director of scheduling.
There was that one time. Okay, no, I'm teasing.
Civil dialogue, ladies.
Civil dialogue.
I'll tell you why later, but go ahead.
You want to meet outside? No.
No.
Anyway, so it's very early in the trip, and the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka is basically giving them a state dinner. And President Bush, Sri Lanka, I think, was the most heavily damaged. The damage was just horrible. And President Bush felt it was time to go. He felt that she either needed to go to bed or go back to work, but she felt that the two presidents the dinner was over and that they needed to leave so she could do what she needed to do. And President Clinton wasn't ready to leave, and his staff wouldn't pull him out. They said, no, we don't do that.
I was not on the trip.
You were not on the trip. The chief of staff's name was Laura. I knew I would think, Laura Graham. So I told President Bush, we just have to wait for President Clinton. He said, I got this. So he walks up to your boss, taps him on the shoulder from behind, and said, Bill, we have got to go. These people have a disaster on their hands. We've got to say goodnight. I want you to go get in the car right now. To which President Clinton said, yes, sir. And so the rest of the trip, Mrs. Bush really felt that President Bush was the father that President Clinton never had. And I think it began on that trip. President Clinton was protective and taking care of him. And President Bush would be like, Bill, hey. And he would say, yes, sir, yes, sir. So one morning in Thailand, I'm on the front porch waiting for President Clinton to come get in the motorcade. President Bush is in the car reading a book, and President Clinton comes out on the porch. He didn't see me, and he said he sees President Bush in the car, and he said under his breath, oh shit, I'm in so much trouble.
And what did you say? Did you say, it's okay?
I said, it's okay, sir. It really is okay. But they left on that trip as colleagues who had a common purpose, a common mission, and they came home best friends. I could tell you 100 stories about their friendship, and they just loved each other to death. And Jake, I remember I forgot to show a photo at the end. Is it too late to go back to the funeral photo? Someone took a picture of this, President Clinton. This is President Bush's funeral. Go to the next photo, Jake. This is,
Oh, that's
I
so
can't,
wonderful.
oh, there it
That's
is.
you.
This is me greeting President Clinton as he came in the church, but show Jake the next photo, what happened next.
It's there on the left.
Oh, it's on the
it's there
left.
on the left,
It's
yeah.
on the left.
Yeah.
He literally started sobbing in my arms. He just started sobbing, and I'm literally patting him on the back saying, "It's okay, it's okay." He was just heartbroken. And after, so they went to their seats, and I went and sat in my seat, and the man behind me said, "Who the hell are you?" He says, you appear to know everybody in this church. And he was the ambassador from Canada to the United States. And I says, well, I'm President Bush's chief of staff. And I basically seated this entire church. And he said, why is President Clinton weeping in your arms? And I said, because his best friend just died.
Oh, wow. That's really,
Oh, boy, that gets me choked up. So
Yeah.
take it, Steph.
well, you know, there's so many, as you said, there's so many stories. And to do a little plug for her book, if you haven't bought the first book, you should probably go and get on Amazon or get online and buy that one too, because a
Thank
lot
you.
of these wonderful stories are in the book. But again, just to paint a little bit of a contrast, because we're here to have honest dialogue and
Absolutely.
conversations.
Yes.
As you mentioned, after that very bitter campaign, it wasn't always like that. And it took a George Bush to understand that our democracy and our Constitution matter more than sort of, you know, his hurt feelings or winning or losing. I want to remind you that, you know, there was a really challenging, tough race between 43 and Al Gore.
Al Gore.
And it was pretty tough and divisive, and obviously we all were watching out the hanging chads, and the Supreme Court weighed in, and while Vice President Gore and many others did not agree with the decision, you may remember Vice President Gore's speech to the nation at that point was so gracious and put all the bitterness behind. He came out and said, we need to support our president, very reminiscent of what President George H.W. Bush said. And, you know, our nation came together, there was the peaceful transfer of power, and, you know, life went on, the democracy went on.
So I have a PS to that story.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I do. So Vice President Gore, after the Supreme Court ruling that basically declared that George W. Bush had won the election, Vice President Gore gave this amazing address to the nation, and I'm at home watching it in Houston, Texas, and President Bush called me. President Bush, well, he was at that point the only President Bush 41. And he said, Jean, do you have a phone number for Al Gore? I would like to call him. And I said, you know, sir, I'm not sure you're calling Vice President Gore tonight is such a good idea. I'm not sure he's the person, you're the person he wants to hear from tonight. And he said, no, he said, his speech was amazing. And I want to thank him for giving that speech. He's so gracious. But he said, you know what, Jean, I know exactly how he's feeling. I know I've lost. I know what it feels like to lose. I would like to talk to him. I think I can be helpful. I still had my doubts, and he said, how do I get a hold of him? I said, well, through the White House switchboard. And he said, oh, I don't need you, and he hung up. So I'm watching television, and they're showing that it was all about Vice President Gore. The Governor Bush, the president-elect, was going to address the nation shortly. But they're literally following the vice president comes out of the old executive office building in D.C. They show him getting in his car, and then you see him picking up the phone. And I'm at home thinking, oh, surely not. Well, sure enough, 5 minutes later, President Bush called me. Jean, I just had the best conversation with Al. I think he was really grateful that I called, and we had a great talk, and I thanked him for what he did for the nation tonight, and I gave him some pointers on how to lose. I said, okay.
On how to
But
be
once
gracious.
again, that's the way it's supposed to work.
It is.
I
It
love that he
is.
wanted to call Al Gore that night.
Well, and again, very painful evening for me and many people here in this room in 2016. Obviously, it was a very challenging night for the Clinton campaign and for the Clinton family. And the next morning, as you well know, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton reached out and called the incoming 45th president and sent her regards and best wishes. And, you know, again, in her concession speech the next day, made a real effort to bring the country together. And that was a tough pill to swallow. But again, and it was probably actually tougher, I've heard President Clinton say, I think it was tougher on him than it even was on her. Watching his spouse, who he loved so much, who'd worked so hard, and this was her second time, and was the first woman to, you know, be, who had won and was the party of a major, the winner of the major party for president. And then, you know, the same type of thing, you know, put the country first.
Exactly.
Country first. And how do we all learn from those examples, and how do we do that in our lives today?
Well, and that is the thread in all of these stories that have been shared, is putting the country first and the shared humanity, looking at each other as humans, having a foundational relationship, et cetera. And this is the whole reason why, Jean, you and I, sitting in that restaurant, decided to come up with this idea of civil dialogues and sort of take this show on the road, if you will, and give all of our fellow Americans an opportunity to sort of do this. And then, Stephanie, when we ran it by you, you were like, I'm in, I get it. Why did you say yes so quickly? What was it about what this initiative is that prompted you to say, yeah, we're in?
Well, first, I think my work leading the Clinton Foundation here and our work that we do here at the Clinton Center is all really guided by President Clinton's philosophy of our common humanity is more important than our interesting differences. So we try to have our programming, our exhibits, working very closely with Jay. I mean, that sort of is our touch point for the types of opportunities that we strive to make available to students, to teachers, to the public at large. So when you were describing this, I thought, President Clinton is gonna love this. I just said yes because I knew it's exactly what he had in mind when he wanted to put the Presidential Center here in the middle of the country, so that we could have these types of programs, civic dialogue, in places that it's hard to have these kinds of conversations. Let's be honest. Arkansas is a pretty tough place to be right now for everybody.
Texas. So is Texas.
In Texas. And these are the types of events, conversations that we desperately need more of today. And Jay and I are committed from our work together in sort of the civic space, civic engagement, civic dialogue. I mean, we've been talking about these types of opportunities over the last year and a half, and when you brought this up, it was a perfect fit to what we're really trying for the next 20 years of the Clinton Center to have as the main, really our focus area. Mm-hmm. Everything is being put through that prism. So it was a no-brainer for me.
So when we came up with this idea, tonight's a little bit different because we're also talking about Jean's book, and we're trying to connect the dots because this relationship between these two presidents was so important, and it serves as a great model for how we can move forward. But one of the things that Jean and I decided when we were sort of structuring what this would look like is that we did not want to have elected officials on stage. That we want the people who are sitting up here, and in our previous two town halls, the topic was immigration in both of them. The first one was at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston. The second one was at the LBJ Library in Austin. Both on immigration, two different aspects. Immigration is such a huge topic, obviously. There's so many different things you can focus on. And going forward, we'll be looking at other issues. We're going to be talking about the media. We're going to be talking about what our constitutional democracy is. What does that mean? How should we be engaged? So we'll be topical as well. But the other point is to make sure that we also give the audience and people who are watching to have an opportunity to engage in what civil dialogue looks like. Because what we've learned, what people have said to us at these previous events is, I want the opportunity to practice. I want to have a conversation, but I don't know how. One of the things that we asked when you guys all registered, we asked some of you to submit questions, and we got a lot of them. So I'm going to take us through a few of them, and hopefully we'll get to answer as many of them as we can, and then you're going to get a chance to practice. So one of the first questions was, what do you think is behind the lack of civility in current politics, and do you think we'll ever get back to where it used to be? I've got some thoughts on that, but I'm gonna let you go, Jean. You want me to start?
I want you to start.
So I think there are a couple of key things. I think that media and social media combined are a big piece of it. The social media piece is you're able to be anonymous online. You don't have to directly interact with people. It's really hard to hate up close, right? And when you don't see a person eye to eye and you put something vitriolic online and you don't see how that person is impacted, you don't see the tears, you don't see people who literally commit suicide because of things that have been said to them or about them on social media, we don't see each other's humanity. Social media makes it really easy for us not to communicate as humans. So I think that's the first thing. Then, so being a member of the media, not a working member of the media in terms of a television station, but my background is in journalism, broadcast news. I was on the air for 20 years. And when I remember when I graduated from graduate school that sort of the industry began to change. I think that the minute we went to having networks devoted to one point of view or the other is when we started to also see that schism. Because what happens now is we're siloed, and you believe what you believe, and you know what channel to turn on to get that thought reinforced. You don't ever have to watch the other channels if you don't want to. Didn't used to be that way. So I think that's a big piece of it. I'm speaking from the broadcast perspective, but you can say the same thing about print media. And one of the reasons that I love having All Sides as our partner, if you don't know what All Sides is, go to allsides.com. It's a media tech company, it rates media bias. You can go to that website and see a particular story, whatever the story of the day is. And you can see it from the left, from the right, and from the center. You can read the headlines and you can almost figure out what the bias is, right? So one of the things that we have to do is become more engaged and better consumers of media. We need to be more educated about how and when and where we get our information and certainly don't get it off of social media. So that's where I think it's coming from.
I will just follow up on that. I couldn't agree more. And often when I speak to groups and they ask me this question, I said, you have got to have multiple sources of news. You cannot just read one newspaper. You cannot just watch one network news channel. You've got to, I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, the Houston Chronicle. And I, not from cover to cover, but I pretty well take a look at what they're saying every day. And the same way with the news channels, you've got to diversify your news sources. The other thing you have to do is put down your damn phone. You know, how many times have you been out to dinner or, I'm so proud, this is the best audience. First of all, they're not afraid of thunderstorms. Not one person's looking at their phone. And that is a rarity. I've given speeches before where a person in the front row never quit looking at their phone. And I think we have to get off social media and talk to each other and listen to each other And I think that's where social media has really affected how our mind works and our social interactions, is not just because of what we read and see on social media, is that we don't talk to each other anymore. And so is another big piece of advice I have for everybody, is to get off your phone, get off your device, and go to an event like this. Go to a neighborhood gathering. Volunteer. Gee, there's a thought. Go be a point of light and do some good community work, and you will meet people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, but have maybe the same passion you do, to teach someone how to read, to help feed the homeless, to solve all sorts of problems. So just get out there, I think, is one solution.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, I'm going to focus on politics and where we are in politics today. When my first job out of college was working on the Hill in the late 80s, and I worked for the Senate Budget Committee. I worked for the majority, but we also, the minority staff. I was on the majority staff, and everyone knows it flips depending on who, how the Congress and the makeup. But what I remember is like having relationships with people that thought differently than I did. We went out together, the majority staff, I worked for both sides. So I had to give the same level of respect to the minority staffers, because I was the staff assistant, I was serving everyone. And I really do think it starts at the top. I remember our senators, both Senator Dale Bumpers from Arkansas and Senator David Pryor. Again, it starts at the top. They both had such, collegial relationships with people in the opposite party. And of course, they came onto the floor and had impassioned speeches about policy. But when they went home and on the weekends, their children played together, their children went to school, like they treated each other as human beings. So I do think the examples start at the top. And over the last 20 years, we've seen our politics get so mean-spirited and ugly. We've stopped, again, I'm quoting President Clinton, he always talks about, we need to see people as human beings instead of two-dimensional cartoon characters. Yeah. And, you can analyze why, is because there's so much money and members have to come home and fundraise. They don't, spend time with each other. But it's become so ugly and so divisive, and compromise and working together has become a dirty word. Yes. If you tried to work with someone on the other side in this day and age, you are completely shut out or demonized by some people on both sides of the far edges of both parties. So I think we have to, in every aspect of our life, try to figure out how to come back to the center. How do we look at other people as human beings? How do we start a conversation with something maybe we can agree on, or at least mutual respect? And we've lost that.
And I'm glad that you framed the kind of what the politics looks like now versus what it used to be. So one of the questions that we had from the audience, I have some friends and relatives with radical views opposite of mine, and seem to always want an argument. I've been saying I don't discuss politics or money. Is it best to change the subject or attempt a dialogue? We have to dialogue. Not dialoguing is what got us here. It's a big piece of what got us here. We have to figure out how to dialogue. So let's talk a little bit about how we might go about doing that. One of the things that I'm going to shout out my husband who's here with me tonight. His name is Lou, my sweet Lou. So, hello. Sweet Lou. There are two things that I want to say. One, he never met a stranger, okay? So we literally can get into an elevator with 3 or 4 people, and by the time we get to the bottom or the top, he's friends with at least 1 or 2 of them, or he knows something about them. The guy who pumps gas knows about his kid, knows about, his family. He's telling the gas pump guy, yeah, we're going to the Clinton Center next week. You need to tune into the live stream. Does he know what the guy's politics are? No. Does he care? No. One of my other favorite stories about Lou is he had a dear friend who recently passed away, who was a complete political opposite. And they used to go at it. I would hear them on the phone, debating, talking about whatever the issue was. And sometimes they would talk for an hour. And at the end of every conversation, it was, love you, man, I'll see you next week, or let's have lunch, or whatever. They could talk, they could disagree, but they loved each other as humans. And they saw the best in each other, and they were there for each other all the time. Complete political opposites. So that's one of the ways, just talk to people. As you said, get off your phone, say hello, greet people when you see them on the street or in the grocery store, or hold the door open and say thank you. And I mean, you never know when you're going to be able to actually engage with another human being, but we have to try. Not trying is not the answer.
How do we, I'm sorry, I'm taking over your job here, but I do this all the time.
No, do, go.
You mentioned, like, you always say, people say, is it best to just not have these conversations and just say, I don't talk about politics? How do you handle this at, like, family dinners or holidays or Christmas? Like, it can be, I hear my friends talking all the time, like, we don't even want to go this year because we know it's going to devolve into a terrible argument. It's going to ruin the dinner. Like, how do you, Jean, how would you deal?
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. I actually have some friends who have some real issues in their family divided by politics. This is going to sound almost too simple, but it can work. I agree, you have to have a dialogue, but I think you set a time limit. I think you decide as a family, it's Thanksgiving Day, and I think you decide as a family that if we're going to talk politics, we're going to do it for 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. And everybody gets a turn to talk about who they're supporting, what their issues are, why they don't support the other person, give everybody a chance to have their say. But when the time is up, the time is up. Politics is done. You talk about the weather, you talk about the football team or your baseball team, you talk about the family.
Things you agree on.
Things you
have in
agree on,
common.
and you never let it come to the dinner table, ever. Now, I'm a good one to talk because about a year ago, I literally walked out of a dinner party that my neighbor was having. I got so mad at the conversation. I'm not going to say what I said, but I got up and said, I don't need this. And it was a little more colorful, and I walked out. And that probably was not the right thing to do. And I learned from that. The good news is my neighbors and I, we made up, we talked it through. They were scared to death of me for a couple days. I sort of liked that. They were just terrified. But we talked it out. I had them over and we talked it out. And so I've done it both ways, and I felt a lot better when we talked it out. And guess what? We don't talk politics anymore. This is my neighbors. We just don't.
Okay, so it's time now for us to sort of get to the part where you guys get to practice. We're going to start by reading these the script together. Our partners at Living Room Conversations have conversation guides designed to help us all practice skills like listening, empathy, and curiosity that allow us to tap into our shared humanity that President Clinton talked about in the video clip. These small group conversations are a simple, sociable, structured way to practice communicating across differences while building understanding and relationships. Typically, 4 to 7 people meet in person or by video call for about 90 minutes to listen to and be heard by others. Our conversation tonight will be an abbreviated 30-minute version. And rather than debating or trying to convince others, we'll take turns talking to share and learn and be curious.